All right, let's dive into today's webinar, which is titled Master the Art of the Resume Summary, a Guide to Writing a Standout Introduction. Here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. First, we're going to provide a little context by explaining what a resume summary is and why you need one on your resume. Next, we'll cover the different elements that are worth including in your summary. Then we'll discuss tailoring your summary to match the job description with each application you submit. And as the last part of our presentation, we'll go over some common mistakes that you'll want to avoid when crafting your own summary before we move into our live audience Q&A so that you have a chance to ask your questions directly with one of our career experts. Okay, so let's get things started by going over the purpose of a professional summary. So the primary purpose of including a summary on your resume is to essentially present sort of a brief synopsis or explanation for why you are a strong candidate for the position to which you are applying. Like it says in that first bullet point, you're aiming to demonstrate that there is alignment between your skills and experience and the role at hand. You can almost think of it as like connecting the dots and explaining your potential value to the employer in the context of that specific job. And the reason you want to do this is so that you can kind of quickly catch the attention of the recruiter or hiring manager and get them to keep reading about you. You've likely heard the statistic that recruiters and hiring managers initially only spend somewhere between 5 to 10 seconds skimming your resume. Well, by including a summary section at the top of your resume that shows the direct alignment between your value and the role they are looking to fill, that's going to help you catch their attention and then get them to want to read more about you. And this is why, like we'll talk about later, it's so important to tailor your resume summary to each individual job that you apply for. Tailoring your summary and showing this type of alignment that we're talking about is not only going to help the employer kind of begin to understand your fit for the role and actually start to envision you as an ideal candidate, but it's also going to help you stand out from the crowd because so many people don't bother to do this. They just submit, generic resumes with sort of one size fits all summaries or no summary instead of taking the time to tailor their summary for each individual job. And something else that's worth mentioning in sort of our overview of professional summaries here is that they have essentially replaced objective statements, which were typically expected on a resume, but are now considered outdated. The vast majority of career experts agree that summaries are better than objectives because of what we've just discussed. They give you the chance to kind of highlight your specific value and demonstrate your alignment with the role that the employer is looking to fill. Objectives, on the other hand, they focus more on your specific goals and what you want, when really you want to think of your resume as, yes, technically being about you, but really being about them, showing how you can fulfill their needs and priorities and perform in the role that they are looking to fill. Objectives also tend to be, far more passive, lack specific detail, and kind of fail to highlight your relevant strengths and qualifications. So a summary is the best bet for starting your resume rather than using an objective statement. Then in terms of formatting and style, there are a few different options that you can consider with your summary. I personally like to lump together a summary, which would be a brief paragraph, somewhere between 3 to 5 sentences. I like to lump that in with a concise list of key skills or core competencies. This gives me a chance to not only show my alignment with the role, but also work in some of the most important technical or transferable skills that were mentioned in the job description. And I'll give you an example of this type of format towards the end of this webinar. Some people, though, prefer to only have a paragraph as their summary, which you'll also see in some of our examples. And then others still like to use a bulleted list of highlights or highlighted achievements instead of a summary. Really, it's up to you, but I would probably encourage you to use the first option that I mentioned, the brief paragraph followed by a concise list of key skills or core competencies. And if you check out the resources in the handout section of this webinar, you'll see a resource that is titled Samples, Templates, and Scripts. And in there, you can see some example resumes and review some of the different ways that you could format your professional summary at the top of your resume. And I just wanted to throw that out there in case you are more of a visual learner and maybe wanted to check out those examples for yourself. Okay, so we've started touching on this a bit already, but let's go ahead now and do a deeper dive into the key elements or components of a solid resume summary. Different people have different preferences when it comes to the, sort of writing and style of resume summaries, but the most essential elements to include in your summary tend to stay the same because, again, the point is to show alignment between what you have to offer and what the role entails. This is why I would point out that last bit of information on this slide first, and why we'll be talking more specifically about tailoring your summary to each job in the next section. Relevance is going to be the most important component of your resume summary. If your summary isn't relevant to your reader, then they aren't likely to spend more than that 5 to 10 seconds reviewing your resume that we talked about, and you could quickly find yourself in the no pile. So you want to keep that relevance in mind. It is the most important aspect of your summary. In terms of that relevance, it's typically helpful to mention, the job title of the role that you're applying for as you begin to, describe yourself, or at least use a similar title or descriptor that kind of encompasses the nature of that job title, because that's going to help not only with incorporating keywords into your resume, but it's also going to show that relevance and help the reader kind of begin to envision you in that position if you are referring to yourself as that job title. Then you want to kind of concisely describe some of your most relevant skills, achievements, qualities, and experiences that connect with this role and make you a strong candidate. Remember, you want to demonstrate that alignment. So think about the things that you've done in the past and the skills that you've honed that now make you a good fit for this specific role. And when you're doing this, you're going to need to prioritize what you share about yourself because you can't list everything you've ever done. So you want to base that on what you're seeing in the job description. You want to keep it relatively brief. So try to use a critical eye and focus on the most important aspects of the job description and the aspects of what you bring to the table that paint you in the best possible light in terms of that context. The goal there is to kind of quickly show your potential impact and value by summarizing some of the relevant highlights of your career, not to write a long sort of drawn out autobiography. And a good way of thinking about this is to kind of compare your resume summary to an abstract that you might read at the beginning of a research paper. It quickly lays out some of the most important information that you can then read about in greater detail in the actual paper. That's what your summary does for your resume. And it's also important to write your summary and really all of your resume from a third person perspective. So avoid all uses of words like, I, my, me, or we, and instead try to use strong action verbs to describe your background and showcase your value. I also included a resource with some solid action verbs that you can use in the handout section. And I recommend trying to use a diverse mix of verbs. You don't want to just keep saying like managed, directed, or achieved over and over and over again. And lastly there, in terms of important elements, it can be helpful to inject some quantifiable metrics, if available and applicable, to make your achievements and accomplishments stand out more prominently and better emphasize the magnitude of the work you did or the results you achieved. This isn't always possible, which is okay. And if you do include metrics, make sure that you aren't just repeating the exact same accomplishments later on in your bullet points. You can revisit those successes when describing individual jobs. You would just want to make sure you're describing them using a bit different language so that it doesn't look like you're just copying and pasting them directly from your summary or vice versa. But now let's go ahead and take a look at a template of sorts that you could use as a framework for building your own professional summary. Here is a general template that you could potentially use as you are crafting your summary. Now, this isn't the only way that you could organize your summary, but summary writing is not something that necessarily comes natural to all of us. So I think it's helpful to share templates like this that include the essential elements in a logical order to at least get you started. And you'll see that this template is 4 sentences long, which is right around that ideal length that we mentioned earlier. It also suggests starting with an adjective that quickly describes you as the job title in a relevant way. It then goes on to explain the number of years of experience that you have in the key skills or expertise area that should be directly related to the job at hand. From there, it has you go on to explain some of your relevant and ideally quantifiable achievements, which will help demonstrate that you aren't just experienced in this type of work, but you're also successful at it. Then we have some relevant key skills emphasized, which should be taken directly from the job description. And then it finishes with something similar to an objective statement. Personally, I don't end my summaries with this type of a statement. I usually will just have one more sentence explaining some other key skills or relevant accomplishments. But a lot of people feel that this type of statement kind of concludes the summary in a nice way, kind of rounds it up nicely. So I wanted to share that as an option. And again, you don't have to use this template, but it could be a good place to kind of get you started, especially if you've never written a summary like this before. So let's go ahead now and look at a few sample summaries. Here is a sample professional summary that follows that template pretty closely, though not entirely. And I'll pause a moment to let everyone read this. So we can see in this sample that they start with an adjective, though not a particularly relevant or strong one. They then use the descriptor of marketing professional rather than a specific job title, which is okay. We can assume that marketing professional is still closely related to the job to which they're applying. They then mention their years of experience, and then they talk about their relevant area of expertise, just like we saw in the template. One note or sort of side comment here that I want to make is that you want to be careful with how you're listing your years of experience. If the job description is asking for more than you have, you might not want to draw attention to that. And so it'd be okay to leave it out. If you have significantly more experience than what they're looking for, kind of on the flip side here, you might not want to draw attention to that either because you might be fearful or concerned that they're going to view you as being overqualified. That's why using the plus symbol can be really helpful. If they want 5 years of experience, but you have 9, it isn't a lie to put 5+ years of experience, especially since they listed 5 specifically in the job description. But let's go ahead and get back to this sample specifically. After that first sentence, they then list out some relevant accomplishments and also list out some key skills that we would assume are probably mentioned in the job description. You'll notice, though, that this sample doesn't end with that sentence that I compared to an objective statement in the template, which is perfectly okay. Instead, this person is explaining a few more relevant skills that they possess and then ending by explaining something that they are kind of passionate about or committed to by listing that they are dedicated to driving innovation, which still, I think, kind of rounds out the summary nicely. But one other thing that I'll note, which we'll come back to when we talk about common mistakes, is this person does use some sort of cliched language, like where they put proven track record. It's not the end of the world to use a cliche or two, especially since there is an element of subjectivity when it comes to what is or isn't cliche. Just try your best to not be, too repetitive or mundane with your word choice. The goal is to kind of be engaging and impactful for your reader. Okay, so here we have another example, and I'll again pause for a few moments so you can read this one on your own. All right, so we can see that this one is very similar to the previous one, but some subtle differences in word choice make this one, I think, a bit more impactful and engaging. For instance, they decided to describe themselves as a specific job title, which we can assume matches the job that they're applying for and can create a, better sort of more immediate connection with the reader. Then rather than saying that they have experience, developing and executing digital marketing campaigns, they say crafting and deploying, which sounds a bit more, assertive and kind of takes ownership a bit more over those responsibilities. In that second sentence, they mentioned that their efforts have been successful enough that they've actually been recognized for them, which can kind of bolster that accomplishment a bit further. Their third sentence references delivering measurable results, which might have been good to include here directly, but at least it's got me expecting to see some quantifiable metrics explained later on in this resume. And then they finish with a stronger sentence saying that they are known for some crucial qualities that they list there, rather than the last sample that we looked at where they simply stated that they had, some strong skills like communication. We do, though, still see some cliches, like when they refer to themselves as a dynamic marketing strategist. Dynamic isn't necessarily a great adjective because it is a bit vague and it tends to be overused. But again, one or two cliches isn't necessarily going to completely ruin a resume summary. But once again, very similar summaries. But think about the language and the wording that you're using as you create and refine your summaries, because it can go a long way to making your resume more engaging and impactful, like I mentioned. All right, so I know that I have talked about and alluded to this quite a bit already, but now let's take a deeper dive into tailoring your resume summary to each individual job to which you apply. So you've probably heard before that it's important to tailor your resume. At the very least, you've heard it from me early on in this webinar. But what this means is that you want the information you include on your resume to be as relevant as possible to the person who will be reading it, meaning the recruiter or hiring manager. This means showing the relevant skills, experiences, and qualifications that you bring to the table that align well with the role and make you a strong fit for the position. Like we've already touched on, you want to do this so you can catch their attention and get them to keep reading your resume. You'll get them to understand how you're a strong fit and then hopefully ask you to participate in an interview. And like that first bullet point on the slide says, your summary section is one of the best places, if not the best, to focus the bulk of your tailoring efforts. The reason for this is that they are likely to read your summary first, so it will help you kind of hook the reader in. But also, you don't necessarily want to rewrite your entire resume and retailor your entire resume from scratch every time you submit an application. So instead, you can use this method that I personally use to tailor your resume. So every time that I am job searching, there's usually somewhere between 2 to 4 different types of roles that I am targeting. They're typically pretty similar in nature, but they also have some distinct nuances. So what I do is I create a base or master resume that is tailored to each one of those roles. So if I'm targeting 3 different types of roles, I have 3 base resumes that I'm working with. All of those base resumes still contain the same experiences, but the way that I describe my past jobs, the skills that I emphasize, the accomplishments that I showcase, and even the order of my bullet points are going to be different based on what is most relevant to each type of role that I am targeting. Then, when I find a job I want to apply to, I'll make a copy of the base resume that is most relevant to that job, and I'll rename it Keith Spencer Resume for, and then whatever the company's name is. From there, I'll then use the job description to craft a professional summary at the top of that resume that is tailored even further to this specific role rather than just this type of role. And this allows me to, include more keywords and phrases, essential skills and qualifications, and other things that will be specifically, relevant and will resonate with this particular audience in the hopes that I can effectively catch their attention. And I'll also double check, the rest of the resume to see if there are maybe some ways that I could emphasize, specific skills or accomplishments further in order to help me stand out from the reader. But that's a really good way to tailor your resume and your summary for a specific job without having to write a brand new resume every single time. And something that I haven't included in the other summary examples that I've shown so far, but which will be included in an example on one of the next slides, is to also list some of those key skills or core competencies directly after the summary. I mentioned that a little bit earlier on. That can be a great place to list out some of your most relevant and important attributes that you also found in the job description. So looking for that overlap there. But you do want to be careful with your summary and with your resume in general, that you're not just keyword stuffing, just jamming in as many keywords and phrases from the job description as possible. You also want to make sure that you're providing context. For example, it's perfectly fine to list like problem solving as a key skill at the top of your resume if it was specifically mentioned in the job description, but you would then want to make sure that you have, a bullet point at some place on your resume that, explains a problem that you've solved in the past and the positive results that you achieve from whatever solution you implemented. Otherwise, you're simply claiming that you possess that skill without providing any evidence to support that claim. So it's important to remember to provide that context. Okay, so now let's look at an actual example of how you can break down a job description and then tailor your summary to that job description. Here we have two lists of some responsibilities and qualifications taken from an actual project manager job description. What I did with this description is the actual method that I like to use myself when I'm job searching. First, I make sure to copy the entire description and then paste it into like a Word doc or a Google Doc. That way, if they take down the job posting before the interview rounds begin, I have a copy that I can refer back to. Then I make sure to read through the posting carefully, and I try to pick up on all the most crucial aspects of the role, and I highlight different, keywords, role or industry specific phrases, skills, and competencies that stand out as being integral to the job. These are the elements that I will then want to try to incorporate into my summary, as well as, some other places in my resume if possible and applicable. Now I'm not going to be able to fit everything from the job posting in my resume, and that's okay. The main point is that I'm, paying attention to things that my audience, meaning that recruiter or hiring manager, has indicated that they want to see in potential candidates. And incorporating these components into my summary is going to help me catch their attention, show that alignment between my value and their needs, and help me stand out from the competition, just like we've been talking about this entire webinar. But let me go ahead and, kind of pause for just a few moments so you can skim through these bullet points before I show you the summary I created based on this job description. Okay, now we'll move to the next slide so you can see what a summary tailored to this role might look like. So here is the summary that I put together based on that job description on the previous slide. And you'll see it's fairly similar to the other examples I shared in terms of style and length, but it's specifically tailored to that previous job description. I went ahead and highlighted in blue all the keywords or phrases that were also in the job description with some slight differences here and there. For instance, the job description said coach, and in this summary, I put coaching. Then in gray, I highlighted some words or phrases that weren't explicitly mentioned in the job description, but are highly relevant and closely related to it. For instance, I started with the adjective client focused because it was mentioned in multiple places in the job description that the person in this role would be, working with clients, working on client projects, and needs a client service mindset. So that was sort of a relevant adjective for me to put in there, even though I didn't pull it directly from the job description. And then we have, that 2-line list of key skills or core competencies at the bottom there that are all directly pulled from the job description, which is why I didn't bother to highlight them in blue because they would have all just been highlighted. But let me pause a moment so everyone can read this summary without me distracting you, and then we'll go over a couple other details that are worth mentioning. Okay, so like we talked about previously, you don't need to fit all the keywords or phrases from the job description into your summary or other places in your resume. You just want to make sure that your summary and overall resume speak to the needs and priorities of your audience, which is what I aimed to do with this summary. You'll also see that I tried to provide context around the terms that I included because I didn't want to just keyword stuff like I mentioned previously. Each keyword or phrase is used in a logical way that fits in context with the type of work this person has done and in line with what will be relevant to their audience. I would also, for the list of key skills, hope to provide context for them later on in some of my bullet points so I can provide evidence to the claim that I actually possess those skills. Another thing to mention is that I didn't exactly provide any quantifiable metrics, but I did touch on some accomplishments like on-time delivery within budget and how I was able to, decrease project escalations and improve client satisfaction. It's always good to highlight your successes, and if I had numbers to back up those successes, they would help me make an even stronger case for my candidacy. But hopefully those earlier samples, paired with this breakdown here of a job description and a sample summary tailored to that job description, can give you a good idea of what a strong summary should look like in order to help you stand out from your competition. So before we end our presentation and move on to our Q&A portion, let's go over a few common mistakes that you sometimes see with resume summaries so that you can hopefully avoid them when you're writing your own. Okay, so let's run through these here. So the first one there, it's important to not be too vague or take a one-size-fits-all approach. So remember to tailor your summary for each application. You also want to remember that you should keep it pretty concise, sticking to just 3 to 5 sentences so that it isn't too long and you end up, losing their attention. Be careful to not have a summary that is actually just an objective in disguise because objectives are too self-focused and outdated, like we talked about. Along similar lines to being too vague or generic, you want to make sure that you're not including information that will be irrelevant or fail to connect with your audience because that's a surefire way to lose their attention. You also want to avoid using cliches like we discussed. Some of the main ones to avoid include, calling yourself like a team player or a self-starter or an outside the box thinker, or maybe describing yourself as detail-oriented, self-motivated, or someone who works well under pressure. Those overused sort of adjectives or descriptors can be too cliche. You want to leave them out. And like with all other aspects of the job search process, you also want to make sure that you aren't being dishonest or lying in your summary. And then make sure that you aren't forgetting to tailor your summary to the job description. And like we talked about, you don't want to just keyword stuff without providing context to the things that you're mentioning. Okay, so we'll head to our Q&A in just a moment, but let's close out with a few action steps and reminders that you can take away from this webinar. So first, review the crucial components of an effective summary so you can make sure that your summary will help you stand out from other applicants, which is the goal. Then pay careful attention to the job description so that you understand your audience and know what will be relevant and impactful to them. Then tailor your resume summary for each application so you can effectively show the alignment between your value and their needs, and avoid common resume summary mistakes like using too many cliches, being too vague, or using an objective instead of a summary. Okay, so hopefully that information was helpful to you all in writing your own resume summaries. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion of our webinar. As a reminder, a copy of the recording as well as some resources presented or discussed within the presentation will be emailed to you within a week. Be sure to check your spam folder just in case it gets filtered there. For even more tips, tricks, and resources, I recommend going to the FlexJobs blog. You'll see the URL there on the screen. It includes a vast amount of free articles, resources, and webinars for members and non-members alike. Now let's open up to your questions. Please remember to type them in the Q&A area rather than the chat section, and feel free to give a thumbs up to anyone else's question that you'd also like to have answered so we know which ones are most popular. All right, everyone, we are going to move into the Q&A portion of our webinar now. Before we dive into your questions, could someone let me know in the chat section that you're able to hear me clearly? All right, wonderful. Thank you for confirming that. So my name is Keith Spencer, and I'm one of our career experts here at FlexJobs, and I will be answering your questions for you. So let's head over to that Q&A tab together, and we will start answering questions, beginning with the ones that have the most upvotes. So our first question here, this person is saying that they've taken a rather long career break, and they have been working, excuse me, fumbling over my words today. They've taken a rather long career break where they have been working different sort of temp or kind of easier jobs while they've been prioritizing their personal development and mental well-being. How can I address this in my summary? So I don't think you necessarily need to address the fact that this has been a break for you directly in your summary. You could, in your professional experience section, have a career break entry that mentions that you took that time off, but you were working, several jobs during that time. Anything else that maybe you were doing to stay professionally active. I'll mention, sorry, as an aside here, in that resources tab, if you go to the one that says, FlexJobs maintains this library of samples, templates, and scripts, that will show you some examples of different career break entries that you could include in your professional experience section. But getting back to your question, so I probably wouldn't mention the break in my summary. I would focus on, in terms of the temp or easier jobs that you've been doing, I would focus on the transferable skills that you've used in those temp or easier jobs that are relevant. Talking about things like, your ability to communicate effectively, work with a team, solve problems, manage your time wisely. Those are the types of skills that are kind of present in all jobs. So you could mention those types of things, and or you could mention sort of your earlier experience before you took this break that is going to be highly relevant. You have to keep in mind, like with your summary, or it's important to keep in mind, I should say, you don't have to say I have this experience which happened 7 years ago when I was in this job, and I have these skills which I used 10 years ago in this job. Like, you don't have to assign dates. You're just sort of talking about yourself in a general sense. You're summarizing what you bring bring to the table. So you don't necessarily, like I said, need to differentiate, where those skills came from, when they happened. You don't need to emphasize the fact that you've been on that break and working some kind of part-time or easier temp jobs there. You could, like I said, explain that in a career break section, or you could list those jobs out separately in your professional experience section, however you're more comfortable with it. And I would probably base that myself, kind of on the length of time that I was at those different jobs. But just focus on what's going to be most relevant to the job to which you are applying. So emphasizing those relevant transferable skills, those earlier experiences that are relevant, just trying to again kind of catch that reader's attention and get them to continue reading your resume, and hopefully read your cover letter and the rest of your application as well. Good question, though. Hopefully that answer was helpful for you. And I appreciate you sharing that little bit about yourself and asking that question. Okay. All right. So kind of a similar question here, but definitely a good one that I think is going to be relevant to quite a few of us. So this person's trying to make a career change of sorts. They want to transition to a new career. So what is the most important things that they should be highlighting? So similar to what I mentioned in that last response, focus on, okay, yes, I'm making a career transition, but what sort of skills do I have that are transferable to this new role? And you might have noticed in that last one, when I was talking about transferable skills, I was focusing more on sort of soft skills, your communication, your time management, things like that. But you could also pull in, you might have relevant technical skills, like maybe you used like a collaborative software program like Google Workspace or something like that in a past job. That might not be really related to the job you're targeting now, but you see Google Workspace mentioned in job descriptions. So you could bring up some of those hard skills as well. And that's just an example of like a technical hard skill. There are other sort of job specific hard skills, like the ability to, explain complex topics, and the ability to, work with customers effectively, things like that, that kind of toe the line between a hard and a soft skill. So just be thinking about like, okay, what is it from what are the things from my past experience, even though my past experience is not directly related to what I'm targeting now, but what is it from my past experience that is now going to be important and relevant to my new audience, meaning recruiters and hiring managers for my new target role. So, analyzing those job descriptions like we talked about in the presentation, that's really kind of your first step. I often, in fact, I'll mention this. I often will kind of liken or compare the job description to your cheat sheet. Like the employers are literally giving you the answers to the test, and they want you to use them. Like they are giving you a list of the things that they want to see in their ideal candidate. So use the job description as your guide for understanding what is going to be important, what is going to be relevant and impactful to them, and then try to demonstrate how you have those things. And like we kind of mentioned, or at least kind of alluded to during the presentation, like you want to make sure that your resume is tailored for each audience. Focusing the bulk of those tailoring efforts on your summary section is really helpful. But I also like to create, sort of base resumes. And what I mean by that is every time I'm job searching, there's usually like 2 to 4 different types of jobs that I'm targeting. And I will create a base resume for each one of those types of jobs. So let's say I'm targeting 2 types of roles. They're probably fairly similar, quite a bit of crossover there, but I'm going to have 2 different base resumes to work from that are targeted or tailored to those target roles. Still include the same jobs on them and everything, but the way that I describe those past jobs, the skills that I'm emphasizing, the accomplishments that I'm showcasing, those will be a little bit different. And then when I find a job that I want to apply for, I make a copy of the appropriate base resume, and then I tailor that summary like we talked about in this presentation. So that's really, just focus on the transferable skills from your other jobs that you've had, even if they're not related, that are going to be relevant and impactful to this new audience. That's really your best bet there. So hopefully that is helpful for you, and I wish you luck with your career transition. Okay, so another good one here. So, should resumes only be one page? If so, what can I leave out if I can't fit everything? And what's the smallest font size that I should use? So, first and foremost, no, your resume does not have to be one page. Just like an objective, a one page resume is kind of an outdated standard. Now, you will still find some recruiters, some hiring managers that prefer to see a one page resume, but that is sort of an outdated sort of mode of thinking. So, you can have a two-page resume. Sometimes you can even have a three-page resume. But I caution you there, just because you can have a multi-page resume does not mean that you should. Like, you want to think about that relevance. So, if I have enough relevant experience that I want to have a two-page resume, okay, I can go ahead and do that. But if you are kind of on the cusp there, like you're going on to like, a second page, but you really only have enough to fill a couple lines. Well, in that instance, you might want to see, can I cut it down to one page? So, in terms of things that you could leave off, you could leave out, things that aren't going to be relevant. So, what I mean by that is like, you might have a job that is closely related to your target role, but not 100% of the things that you do in that job are going to directly translate. So, some of your tasks and responsibilities that might not be relevant, you could omit those. If you've had, multiple roles that are related, you don't need to be repetitive. So if you did a task in your most recent job that is really relevant to this new role, and you also did that in a task that, or you did that task in a job that you held before your most recent role, well, you don't need to say the same thing twice. So you can avoid things that, make you sound repetitive like that. Um, and so hopefully that answers the bulk of your question. In terms of the smallest font size that you should use, some people are okay with going down to like size 10. I try to avoid that myself, like a 10.5 or 11. 11 is what I usually go with on my own personal resume. But you definitely don't want to go smaller than 10. But yes, you can have a multi-page resume. Just make sure that you're keeping it all relevant. You don't want to bore them or run the risk of kind of losing their attention, so to speak. So, good question. Thank you for asking that, and hopefully that is helpful. Let's try to fit in a couple more questions here. Okay, so this person is asking, are cover letters still relevant? This is a big question and one that we get pretty often. And it's the reason I think we get this question a lot is because cover letters are frustrating to people. They're not the easiest thing in the world to write. They can be pretty time consuming. And there's a lot of, different information out there about whether employers even bother to read them. And I'll share some stuff with you that is probably going to further increase your frustration around cover letters. We have heard yes from employers; they're important to us, and we read your cover letter. We have heard from employers saying no, we don't bother with a cover letter at all. And then we have also heard from employers that say we like to see that they're submitted, but we don't bother to read them. So again, some frustrating information there. The way that I view a cover letter is, if it can increase my chances even just a little bit of potentially getting to the interview stage, then it's worth it to me. I am a big proponent of the quality over quantity approach when it comes to submitting applications. I would much rather spend, 2 hours on each application, making sure that I have that tailored resume, that I have that tailored professional summary, that I have a customized cover letter, rather than spamming out, dozens of generic resumes, one size fits all cover letters every single day. So the quality over quantity approach, it might be more time consuming, but it is going to yield better results in the long run. Your return on investment, so to speak, is going to be improved there. Now, with the cover letter, we do have some good resources I recommend checking out, but you want to treat it a little bit similarly to your resume. But basically, what I recommend is going in for the body paragraphs of your cover letter, kind of picking like 3 to 5 specific things from that job description that stood out as being like really important or integral to that role, and then doing a deeper dive into those things than you did on your resume. Your resume, you're kind of just sort of succinctly or concisely saying, listen, I have this, 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 and this that you're looking for. And you're not going into a ton of detail because, you need to be concise. You don't want to it to be, many, many, many pages long. Your cover letter, you can pick a few of those things and then go into greater detail and kind of tell the story a little bit more. Like you can think of your resume as kind of your list of highlights, relevant highlights, and then your cover letter is your opportunity to tell the story a little bit more there. But I, again, definitely think that it's a good idea to submit a cover letter. There is a chance that it's a little bit of wasted effort, but once you get good at writing cover letters, it's really only going to take you like 20, maybe 30 minutes to write a cover letter. Same kind of thing with writing your summary, like looking at like 10 to 15, maybe 20 minutes to write your summary. So in my mind, like that's time well worth invested. It's if it can increase the chances that I'm going to get to the interview stage, to me, it's worth it, and I'm going to do it. So hopefully, I'll jump off my soapbox there, but hopefully that was helpful information, and I appreciate you asking that question. All right, let's try to squeeze in one more, maybe two. Okay, so this person is saying they're considering returning to a former career that they actually haven't done in over 20 years. All of my experience since is not related. Should I add the old experience and minimize recent experience? So, really good question there. The approach that I would take in this instance is I would have my professional experience section on my resume that goes back, 10 to 15 years. So I am going to list those more recent jobs that aren't necessarily related, excuse me. I'm going to, like we talked about earlier, focus on the things that are relevant, those transferable skills, whether they be hard or soft skills, focus on the things that could potentially be relevant. I might then also include an additional related experience section where I could include some of those earlier roles with maybe, 2 to 4 bullet points for each of them. I'd probably only include like 2 of those earlier roles, but I'd have 2 to 4 bullet points, and I would omit the dates because that will help me, avoid potential issues related to ageism. And then in my summary section, I'm also going to include, some of those highlights from earlier on in my career that are highly relevant to the type of job I'm trying to get back to. You might even want to. I mentioned in the presentation there that some people like to have kind of a bulleted list as their summary. You could include that as your summary or as part of your summary, or you could create like a highlighted achievements section at the top, like right after your summary, where you're pulling in some of those earlier things to show that you have, the stuff that's going to be relevant to your target employers. So you definitely can find a way of incorporating that other information without entirely omitting your more recent experience. Just focusing on what is relevant from your more recent experience. So hopefully that was helpful for you. I know it's tough when you're trying to make that kind of pivot back to something that you sort of used to do. So hopefully that is helpful, and I wish you the best of luck there. One more question that I'm going to answer, just because it's a quick one, just kind of reiterating some of the stuff we have talked about. This person is asking, what are the key elements that recruiters look for in a resume summary? So just going to reiterate, it's that relevance. Like they use that job description as your cheat sheet. Remember, they're giving you the answers to the test. Really make sure you're analyzing that job description. I like to use AI tools like ChatGPT or Google's Gemini to help me analyze job descriptions, so I can kind of pick out the things that seem really important. But those are the key elements, showing that you have done those things, highlighting some accomplishments that are related to those things, like really using that job description as your guide. Because the recruiter, the initial person that's looking at your resume, they want to pass along candidates to the hiring manager that are a good fit for the role. The role is described in the job description, so you want to reflect the information in that job description to show that you are a good candidate for that role. Okay, so we're quite a few minutes over time, so we are going to go ahead and draw to a close. Really appreciate great questions today. So really appreciate that the insightful questions you all asked. Really hope that this information has been helpful for you, both the information in the presentation as well as the Q&A. Appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and hope that it was a good experience for you all. We do have one more webinar today. We kind of crammed in a full agenda of webinars. We have one at 2 p.m. Eastern, so coming up in just a couple minutes, about using ChatGPT, some of the basics of ChatGPT to help you out in your job search. So if you are interested and available, consider joining us for that one. But again, really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Hope that this was all helpful for you, and I wish you all the best of luck in your job search. Take care.